Our topic today is adaptive worship, and we have with us today Deacon John Weit, who is the ELCA Executive for Worship and has been adapting all along with the rest of us through this time. So, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for inviting me to be here today. As Bob said, I'm John Weit. I serve as Executive for Worship in the Churchwide organization, a position that I've held since since February of 2020. So just before so much changed about the world and about our worship life. And it's been an interesting, I'd say, roller coaster on my end, I'm sure, as it is for all of you in these months since then. I'm excited to be here today to hopefully facilitate more conversation than presentation. Throughout this pandemic, we have been working, all of us, adapting in so many ways and learning from each other. And I continue to learn from those of you who are really on the ground, leading worship, planning worship, and adapting worship for so many different ways. So I hope that you'll be willing to add to this conversation today. Otherwise, I said to Bob, otherwise it'll be a pretty short presentation. But I'm hopeful that we'll review some foundations for worship, why worship is important, review the ways we've already adapted in these last so many months, and then think a little bit about where we're headed, and touch a little bit on Advent and Christmas and some things maybe that we learned last year that we might apply this year. And along the way, I'll share some resources, either sharing some slides or dropping some links into the chat, or we'll discover things together and share things together. So I'm hopeful that you'll be a big part of this conversation. I'm excited, especially to be with the Southeastern Pennsylvania Synod. I was born and raised in Lidditz, Pennsylvania, so just a little bit west of the Southeast Penn Synod, including time in at the seminary, at what's now United Seminary, Lutheran Seminary at the Philadelphia campus, and also served for a year as cantor at Christ Ascension Lutheran Church up the road from the seminary. And actually, I'll be back in Philadelphia in 2 weeks and spending Reformation Day with Christ Ascension, leading worship and music there and helping them dedicate a new instrument and also dedicate the new worship supplement, All Creation Sings, and which I hope we'll also have a little time to talk about later this morning. As I said, we, over these past so many months, have adapted in so many ways in our worship life and our worship practice. And we did that very quickly early on. And whether we were immediately live streaming worship or creating Zoom worship, or providing worship resources for individuals and families to worship in the home, we pivoted quickly, and then we've been learning ever since. And early on, we thought, this was a short-term thing, and we were pivoting for temporary measures. And then the finish line kept moving further down, and now we realize we're not really headed towards a goal where everything's going to revert back to February 2020. And we just continue to learn and continue to adapt. But also, as we look where we are right now and going forward, we still know that there's many questions about the virus, but we have much more science on our side. And so we're much better at understanding and mitigating risks, but knowing that there still are risks for in-person gatherings. But we also know that we still may need to pivot and turn quickly as things change. With the Delta variant, these past few months, we saw things change somewhat drastically, but now maybe are on a little bit better path, but unsure even as we head into Advent and Christmas. But I'm sure most of us find us now in probably doing some in-person gatherings. Many of us are still utilizing technology for worship, either in hybrid ways or at least live streaming what is able to happen in person to engage more folks who either don't feel that it's safe or for other reasons aren't connecting in person right now. And as we move forward, we also need to plan to be flexible. I think that's one key learning that we've learned through this time. But to get us started, before we think about even how we've adapted in these last times, I just want to think together and remind ourselves what is central to our worship. And set aside the modality, whether it's in person or online, but whether you're thinking back to what was important when before the pandemic, what has been important during the pandemic, regardless of the modality. But I'm curious if some people just want to unmute and just say a word or two, and maybe in short phrases, or type some words into the chat. What is important about worship? What is central to our worship?
Liturgy.
Liturgy. Word and sacrament.
An experience of knowing God, feeling God.
Experience of knowing God and feeling God.
Participation.
Participation.
Community.
Knowing God within community.
Community.
I'm sorry, I stepped on somebody there. If you want to try again.
I heard two communities at the same time, so.
Okay.
Music.
Thank you. I was waiting for somebody to say that. I'll add to that singing together. Connecting with God through Jesus Christ.
Mm.
Keeping our people close to the liturgy and the sacrament in these times, especially, through which, music can help us with that.
Mm-hmm. Prayer. I've seen the chat. Listening. I want us to hold these pieces as we think about where we've been and where we're headed, and maybe help. You might relate back to some of these words that we've said as we share experiences and ideas going forward. Also, just to review a little bit where we've been, what are, in short phrases or without going into much detail, what are some of the ways we have already adapted worship? And knowing that that's on a spectrum throughout these last 20 months, but what are things we've had to adapt?
Communion practices.
Communion practices.
We had to adapt almost everything regarding music.
Music. Adapting for social distancing, length of services, adapting to wearing masks. We've adapted how we share the peace. Preaching with a mask on. Doing much of anything with a mask on. Yes, life passages, weddings, baptisms, funerals. Being outdoors, involving children. We've adapted to technology.
To who's a member of the congregation who we're trying to reach, realizing that we can reach people who aren't technically members, but we also are more limited in reaching those who are homebound or immunocompromised, etc.
We've adapted how we use the resources that we have at hand, whether those resources are financial or staff or volunteers.
It might be easier to ask what we haven't.
I wanted us just to dwell in this list for a moment, just to remind ourselves that we've been doing this. We've been adapting all along, and I think learning how to do it better and better as we go along, and how we learn from each other and share those adaptations with each other. There's a great quote in an early resource about safe practices for worship, which I'll share a little bit more in a minute. But it said the coronavirus pandemic has challenged churches to continue being the church, often without gathering in person. Now that quote was from early on when there was very little gathering in person, and now we're balancing that with both meeting online, live streaming in-person gatherings, and having in-person gatherings. And one other, before I forget it here, thinking about how we adapted music over this time, there was an article by my colleague on the worship staff, Jennifer Baker Trinity, in the Living Lutheran earlier this year that highlighted some of those music pieces. So I dropped that link that you might consult that later and think about that more. Throughout the early parts of the pandemic, an ecumenical consultation was formed to help churches, particularly in the United States, think about how, when it is safe to gather in person, what are the things and the benchmarks that we need to do as we're thinking about gathering in person. And that consultation produced a document in I think maybe June of 2020 called Care-Filled Worship and Sacraments in a Pandemic. And in June of this year, the consultation gathered again over a few months and created an updated resource. And I'm sure many of you have already consulted this, but I just want to highlight it that this document, Care-Filled Worship and Sacramental Life in a Lingering Pandemic, I think is still helpful guidance for us as we're continuing to measure and mitigate risk in our in-person gatherings. And I want to highlight just some of the theological foundations that went into this work, because I think some of these foundations are also helpful reminders, just as we were reminded what's core in our worship life and worship practice to think about. So there were 5 foundations. The first one was about love of God and neighbor, and to do that requires careful planning and openness. A want to offer worship that brings our very best, and a want to do everything we can to ensure that we bring no or little harm to anyone when we do gather in person. The second foundation was regard for human bodies and fellowship, that we value the body of believers gathering in one place, an important theme in the New Testament. But we also now recognize the gifts of technology and balancing those in-person gatherings and those online gatherings. But I still think that even though we know that the technology is going to be with us and we're going to find ways to gather in community, both online and in person, but I still think we do value those in-person gatherings when we can do that. The third theological foundation in this work was worship in the sacraments, that we long to celebrate the sacraments together, and we long to invite others to celebrate the sacraments, to come to the table and come to the font. The fourth foundation was inclusive hospitality that welcomes all, but also avoids stigmatizing others. So we know Jesus' teaching to welcome all, and that Jesus' love excludes no one. And so we also find ways to include by other means those who may not freely gather in person. And that's where our technology has helped us. But also avoid any social stigmas that lead to fear or lead to excluding others or blame and discrimination against individuals and communities. So we need to guard against that. And that could be about stigmatism if someone contracts the virus, or stigmatism around vaccines, around mask mandates, and those things. And then the fifth theological foundation was beauty of God, beauty of the world, and beauty of human creativity. That the creative arts and music reflect the beautiful holiness of God, and that takes many forms and requires many degrees of human skill and also technical complexity, especially when we're thinking about hybrid and online worship. But also reminding us that we can find beauty in silence and beauty in simplicity. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Silence is difficult. Silence was difficult when we only gathered in person. I feel like silence is more difficult when we only gather online, but finding ways to be comfortable in silence. And we don't need to do absolutely everything in our worship. That there is some beauty in simplicity, and sometimes the most simple worship services can be quite beautiful and quite meaningful. And then that we also seek fresh ways to express the beauty we know in God and each other and in the whole creation. So those were just some of the things that went into the care-filled worship and sacramental life in the lingering pandemic. And I commend that resource for continued use as we look at particularly the in-person elements of worship that involve physical touch, and the recommendations that are in there. And those things include communion distribution, sharing the peace, and many things that we've already adapted, but maybe you might find yet new ways to think about some of those in this guidance. I will admit that anytime guidance like that is published, it's somewhat immediately outdated when we think about benchmarks and data. So there are some benchmarks in there for considering when we do and don't meet in person that may be helpful in your context. But also we continue to listen to experts and learn about evaluating data in new ways. And so that continues to evolve. And overall, we remain faithful as we think about best practices and realizing that we're still under limits. Our rituals and our worship will be limited in various ways, and that those limits may increase and decrease over time. I'd like to move to a new question, just thinking a little bit more generally about where we are and how we adapt worship. And I'm curious if you might name one or two things that you found helpful, or that you have learned and applied, maybe as we're thinking now, as many of us are probably balancing in-person and online worship in hybrid settings. What's something you found helpful that you want to share?
communion in the parking lot. Some people who weren't coming to church, reluctant to come in because they haven't been there in a long time, etc., are showing up for communion in the parking lot.
Thank you. Sharing the piece using sign languages in the chat. What else have you learned or found helpful? Technology like radio transmitters. Information from the synod or from other bodies to pass on to others. So we're learning from, you found helpful learning from each other. Sharing the peace by honking horns. That's a new one for me. I like that. Knowing that we're all in this together. More ways of connecting and learning with technology. Online prayer requests. As we're discovering right now, you know, in times in worship, you might have encouraged people to voice their prayers. You find people more comfortable to type them into the chat. Finding blessing and being adaptive. Breaking down the walls of geographical boundaries. Worship, that service is worship. Breaking down boundaries of time, worshiping at other times. Being able to worship in 3 congregations at once. Learning that we are more flexible and receptive than maybe we previously thought. Experimentation. Keep adding those things in the chat. I'm going to just give a brief resource here, if I can get the correct screen up. This worship, this resource is not related to the pandemic at all, but it is related to being in conversation about worship. So as you might have a similar question that we're having right now, maybe in your own congregation, I commend this resource to you. And as soon as I get the link, I'll drop that too in the chat. This is a resource that's really about helping worship committees or congregations or maybe groups of congregations just gather their thoughts and evaluate what's going on in worship life. Now, as I said, this was a pre-pandemic resource, so you'll need to take and adapt this a little bit as we're talking about being adaptive. But as you're now having conversations in your congregations, this resource might be helpful to check in with one another about the worship life in your congregation. And it's set up as a single 90-minute session, but it's really easy to adapt. And the objectives of the session is to care for, pray for, and support one another as worship leaders, to provide tools in a spirit of mutuality, not competition, and to reflect on worship lives, and also to connect the contextual liturgical lives with outreach and mission, talking about service there. What I really like is this entire resource is framed around the question, what do you notice in worship, rather than coming in with what do you like and not like about worship. A helpful resource for on this journey. One other piece I want to make sure that you are aware of is the new worship and song supplement, All Creation Sings. Sorry, I thank you for your graciousness as I navigate my multiple screens again. Okay. Just a brief little commercial about this resource, and I'm happy to answer other questions later on if you'd like. But All Creation Sings is a newly curated set of worship resources that falls within the Evangelical Lutheran worship family, that's designed to both complement and expand upon the resources that are offered in ELW and other worship resources. Admittedly, this is another resource that is developed pre-pandemic, but and actually was in its final development in March 2020. It was the month we were making the final editorial decisions and sending things off to printers and engravers and preparing things for online distribution. But I think we found much value in some of these new resources, even as we've adapted how we've utilized them. So obviously singing together has been hampered during this time, but we've been able to learn new texts and new songs through modeling them to others through online means or through sharing in other ways. But just some of the highlights of this resource, there's a shot of the table of contents. It does include two settings of Holy Communion. One of them is a fully bilingual Spanish-English setting, and a service of word and prayer, which the service of word and prayer is really a skeleton or framework for worship that might be more contemplative in nature, that's not a service of Holy Communion, but is really a framework that can be adapted in so many ways. And I've actually found that to be one of the things I've utilized the most during this pandemic in finding, especially in some online worship opportunities. There's also a collection of prayers, thanksgivings, and laments, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the lament in a moment. And then 200 pieces of assembly song that follow groups of categories very similar to those in Evangelical Lutheran worship, but also expands on some of those categories, particularly in the areas of thinking about creation, around lament, around music about justice and society, and music about healing and wholeness. I talked about some of the lament prayer resources a moment ago, and some of those include a prayer of lament, sort of a one-page form of shaping our a time of prayerful lament, a lament specifically around lamenting racism, and also a service after a violent event. In many times, especially in these past several years, we found ourselves gathering for a prayer vigil after something has happened, either in our town or in our country, in our state. And that service after a violent event offers a framework for a prayer service such as that. I talked a little bit just say a little bit more about the assembly song priorities that went into those 200 songs. So I talked already about creation and healing and justice and peace and lament, but also aging, dying, and life transitions. A little more focus on sending, so connecting our worship to mission, and more new texts and music for us to sing throughout the church year. And let's see. That assembly song and All Creation Sings also has an expansiveness in our language and our song for the whole assembly, which that's the piece that we haven't been able to do as much these times. Expansiveness in both familiarity and newness in music, and also expansiveness in our connections to the whole creation. And one other piece I just want to highlight from this is a great teaching tool that appears in this is scriptural images for God. So as we think about expansiveness in language, this appendix is a selection of 100 biblical images for addressing the triune God, a list of metaphors that could be helpful in writing prayers and preachers in their work, but also just a great reference tool for anyone in worship. And Bob, thank you for dropping that link into the chat to learn more about All Creation Sings. So that's my little commercial, but this is a resource that's been really important to us in the LCA and in its development over these past 4 years. And although we didn't expect that it would be released in the midst of a pandemic, we're finding how we're even adapting both how we teach and talk about it, but also congregations are adapting how they use it in these times, but also longing and looking forward. And many of us already are able to sing together again, and now with some new texts in our library. I want to turn a little bit to Advent and Christmas, because I think those are the two seasons in front of us right now. And I want to do just like we did at the beginning when we talked about what was important generally about worship. Let's say a few words about what is central to these seasons of Advent and Christmas. So either themes or maybe rituals or rites. So feel free to unmute and speak about Advent and Christmas, or type it into the chat. Beginning a new traditions. We often associate the word hope with Advent. Thank you, John, for sharing the prison prayer book resource. That is helpful for those who are feeling alone or confined, which we often find ourselves in that, especially in Advent, as for us in the Northern Hemisphere, the daylight grows shorter. Lighting candles. For me, Christmas is thinking about Jesus born as a human and what that means, an incarnation, which is also can be more difficult in times when we can't physically gather. Fulfillment of God's promises. As we think about those pieces that have been meaningful, or at least the undergirding of what it means to live in these seasons of Advent and Christmas. Think now with me about knowing that we've already gone through one round of Advent and Christmas in a pandemic. Admittedly, last Advent and Christmas looks probably much different than this Advent and Christmas will. But what is one thing that you learned or did differently last year that in your context that you might bring back or adapt in a new way this year?
We've already done it. Last year we had a harpist, and we invited her back again this year because there were just 5 of us in the sanctuary last year. But this year we thought if we can have some more people in there, it would still be good. It was really meaningful to people to have that.
It's wonderful.
We did a virtual Christmas play pageant from Illustrated Ministries, and we recorded all the sessions and were able to put them up on Zoom. And we got our kids and our adults involved in being actors. They didn't have to be professional, they could be goofy, but it got the message across. And it's possible, we did record it, so I'm thinking maybe we could put that up on the screen in church and play it again.
Adapt or transitioning from pre-recorded worship elements to live streaming, live worship. I see in the chat. Thinking back to the person who suggested or talked about the harpist, I think one thing as we've been beginning to regather in person, we've been a little better about thinking about what it means to prayerfully listen. I'm thinking more about music at times when we can't really sing together, but still having a sung word maybe by a soloist or a small group able to happen even when we might not have sung together. So I'm hopeful that we've become better listeners, prayerful listeners, and not just as often happens outside of worship, just listening because it's in the background.
We've actually turned the hymn of the day into either a solo event or a duet event. Brings 2 of our singers to the fore so people can get the feeling that they're really hearing a performance. Of course, we distance them if there's more than one, but that seems to be working for us.
It's great. Thank you, John, for reminding us of Las Posadas and a physical gathering, maybe through a neighborhood, going from house to house, sharing the anticipation of Christmas. As you continue to think about things that maybe you did last year that you might adapt, now also add to the mix, what is one thing that we couldn't do last year, but might be possible to do or to adapt in a new way this year? So what's something that we couldn't have done last year that we might consider anew this year? For us, it's gathering indoors for worship. I was just thinking that too. I think I may be able to attend a Christmas Eve service in person this year. That's something I couldn't do last year. Light candles together. For some, it may be being able to sing together this year in limited ways. For some, it may be if a primary weekly worship or even festival Christmas Eve worship is still limited, there might be ways to gather at other times, again in midweek in person, for example, breaking down some of those barriers of time maybe, and thinking about other gatherings at other times. Having bells rung by a choir.
I have heard from some congregations having more services so that they can be together but distanced.
Invite lonely neighbors searching for friends to actually gather at worship again. Keep typing those things into the chat as you think of them. I also think that, as I said earlier about simplicity, that restraint can be a virtue too. So we can't do everything. We don't have the unlimited resources in people to make things happen. Those pastors and deacons called to lead worship in congregations are being pulled in so many directions. So we need to balance being creative and adaptive in realistic ways. And I should say, I don't mean just to say that only pastors and deacons are stretched in many ways. Any of us who lead and plan worship are stretched in so many ways. As you keep thinking about some of those other things, a couple other resources that I might highlight that I have learned from others who have found to be helpful. One is a resource from Augsburg Fortress for Advent and Christmas for Families that is called Families Celebrate Advent and Christmas. These are a deck of cards with a card for each day between the first day of Advent and the day of Epiphany that help families, particularly families with children, mark these passages of time. And I've heard some really creative ways. There's an example of some of these cards. Some of them are dated to specific dates, so that they're just a small devotion or information to share on a day, and others are related to some of the rites and rituals, such as an Advent wreath or house blessing on Epiphany. And I think this has been a really great way for families to connect with the seasons of Advent and Christmas, particularly when we can't be together in person, but at any time. And I think I've known of some congregations who have found ways to utilize these cards in community, so that the cards might be highlighted in weekly emails or other communications, or lifted up on Sunday in worship. And also a helpful devotion for individuals is Heaven and Nature Sing devotionals for Advent and Christmas, which Augsburg Fortress has been producing these devotionals more so in Lent for the past several years, and I believe they added Advent last year, the year before. I'm particularly excited about this year because the theme is Luke's Gospel, and particularly that Luke's Gospel is filled with song, and thinking about some of those songs in Luke's Gospel. And one other piece that some have found helpful around music making, I dropped a link in the chat. There are several music source books that have been produced to surround the evangelical Lutheran worship family, particularly in the time before All Creation Sings was developed. And one of those source books covers the time between All Saints and Transfiguration, with a particular focus on Advent and Christmas. And while that resource was designed with ritual music for in-person worship in mind, I know of musicians who have found creative ways to use some of this ritual music in other ways. There's actually a sung Las Posadas, music for singing Las Posadas for congregations who actually did process around a neighborhood and sang that, but also other music for around lighting Advent wreaths and other rituals around Advent and Christmas that I think can be helpfully adapted even in times when we can't sing together. Somebody mentioned earlier gathering with those who may be lamenting or feeling lonely. Many congregations have a longest night service or a blue Christmas service. And All Creation Sings, I think, helps us with our sung lament and also our prayed lament, and you may find some helpful resources in there for those services. Excuse me. We're also ever more cognizant about language around darkness and light. And that is another theme that's throughout Advent and Christmas. And we also experience a lengthening darkness here in the Northern Hemisphere as we head to Christmas. But also how we have talked about darkness and light, and often equate darkness with sin and death, and dark with black and light with white, and what that means for us. And Bishop Eaton earlier this year encouraged us to value the beauty of darkness in a world where we often equate darkness with evil. And one new hymn in All Creation Sings, I think, helpfully helps us sing about the beauty of darkness, and also hints to Christmas, and might be something that you could work into your Advent or Christmas worship. I just want to read this hymn text to you. The hymn text is called "Joyful is the Dark" by Brian Wren. Joyful is the dark, holy hidden God, rolling cloud of night beyond all naming, majesty and darkness, energy of love, word and flesh, the mystery proclaiming. Joyful is the dark, spirit of the deep, winging wildly o'er the world's creation, silken sheen of midnight, plumage black and bright, swooping with beauty of a raven. Joyful is the dark, shadowed stable floor, angels flicker, God on earth confessing, as with exultation, Mary giving birth, hails the infant, cry of need and blessing. Joyful is the dark, coolness of the tomb, waiting for the wonder of the morning. Never was that midnight touched by dread and gloom. Darkness was the cradle of the dawning. Joyful is the dark, depth of love divine, roaring, looming, thunder cloud of glory, holy, haunting beauty, living, loving God. Hallelujah, sing and tell the story. A hymn text that you might find useful to introduce in in worship or to aid your preaching and proclamation during this time. As we near the top of the hour, I am curious if you have had other roomings on things that you're thinking about in your context for Advent or Christmas that you'd like to share, whether they're things that you've adapted that we might have learned last year or things that we missed last year that may be able to return in a new way. I'll also while you're doing that, remind you of a few ways that that you might continue to connect with me and my team as you continue to plan and lead worship. So do make sure you visit elca.org/worship, and particularly clicking that button that says worship resources will take you to a library of resources that might help our thinking and teaching about worship, and also specifically help specific rites and rituals help plan or offer suggestions. One of the primary resources that I always like to remind people about is our worship frequently asked questions. There are about 100 questions on that website with answers ranging from 1 to 4 pages, helping us think about the church year, ecumenical and interreligious worship, the sacraments, liturgy, music, participation, and leadership in worship space. And also our monthly ELCA worship news, which you can sign up for at elca.org/worship, which highlights resources and also work of companion organizations that help our worship life. And the ELCA worship blog, which has occasional topical blog posts about our worship life or about worship resources such as All Creation Sings. But one new weekly resource to highlight is a resource we've titled Prompts for Prayers of Intercession. Many have benefited from prayers that were written for worship in the home during the first part of the pandemic, which were really geared for individuals and families who could not gather for worship in person or online, to offer a resource for families to worship together in the home. That resource has come to an end. It was seen as a temporary resource, but we know that both people who were worshiping in their homes and online and in person benefited from more resources for prayers of intercession. And also reminded us that more teaching about how we craft the prayers of intercession each week is needed. Many of us utilize prayers in Sundays and Seasons family resources, but due to the realities of publication, those resources are written well before we actually pray them together. And while I do feel that the Holy Spirit is at work, even when those prayers are written even 2 years before we may pray them in community, the Holy Spirit still works through us too, to make sure that we are crafting those prayers for our context and for what's going on in the world at this time. And those weekly blog posts just offer prompts of things that you might want to consider highlighting in your prayer that week for worship. And you can you see my email address there, john.weit@elca.org. I'm always happy to answer questions or receive suggestions. As I said earlier, we learn a lot from what we learn from you who are crafting and creating worship on the ground. And we like to hear about those things. thank you for the additional thoughts in the chat. I think that's about what I have to offer for us today. I want to thank all of you for engaging in this conversation together and knowing that we continue to think about ways we adapt our local worship practices, the ways we adapt worship resources available to us, and the ways we learn from one another. So blessings in your worship planning and worship leadership.
Well, thank you, John. We appreciate your time and sharing your experience.